The spectrum for political views for the corporate media ranges from what, like on the most radical leftist end of it is that Iraq was the bad war and Afghanistan was the good war, or the first Gulf War was the good war and the second Gulf War was the bad war. I wanted to know your guys' thoughts on the media's representation of what is happening.
Katie, one of the things you mentioned is like the left-right spectrum and how circumscribed it really is in American mainstream media. I mean, you'll never hear the phrase state terror, whether it's describing the actions of Israel or the United States, right? Terrorism is one thing. It is a brown person, it is a Muslim person, and it is a suicide bomber, and that's all it is. And if it's like a Palestinian or an Afghan, like more's the better. There's like just a total misunderstanding of that. But I'm going to speak to a different element of this question about how the media is covering it. One of the problems, as Kathy mentioned, and I think the banner came up, like 5 minutes of coverage on Afghanistan in the major networks over the last year, or it's been minimal. Purposefully, I mean, these wars are waged as an abstraction with as much distance between them, because the empire learned. The empire learned that less body bags means it's easier to maintain this low threshold of war. Now, it doesn't feel like a low threshold under those hellfires, but it does for a lot of Americans because it's hidden from you. It's classified in many cases. But most of the commentators about what's happening now started the clock a week ago or 10 days ago. And if you start the clock then, it is all Biden's fault. The problem is that we didn't stay long enough. The problem is that we weren't prepared enough. But if you start the clock earlier, it's a whole different story. What strikes me about the media coverage is who gets to cover it. Who gets to cover it? General Petraeus got like 4,000 words in the New Yorker the other day. General Petraeus, loser of 2 wars, convicted criminal, liar, right? Snake oil salesman extraordinaire. Max Boot still has a column at the Washington Post. So does David Ignatius. Been wrong about everything ever since 9/11. And they're still telling us that the problem is not enough soldiers, not enough surging, more residual forces, and all these terms they come up with. And I think I have a real problem with that notion because they get to decide where they start the clock. They are not able to describe what the meaningful long-term, positives that an American militarized response can provide. And yet the dissenting voices are still largely left out of the media. Now, what's interesting about that is twofold. Let's take Petraeus. Petraeus is utterly out of step with the veterans of the Afghan war. We shouldn't necessarily follow what the veterans say just because they're veterans. I reject that kind of self-righteousness, which is the cardinal sin of the soldier. And my peers don't always love it when I say that. But if 73% of them last year were for full withdrawal, Petraeus is out of step. Max Boot and David Ignatius and whoever else, they're out of step with the civilian population of the United States, which is also sort of has long been against this war. But what they've done is they use the human rights. They use the women's rights. They use the tragedy at the airport as like it's a canard. It's an opportunistic way to say that we need more military force. We should have stayed longer, which misunderstands, I think, the fact that the United States, in many ways, our military response, depending on when you start the clock, actually, if you start the clock anywhere but a week ago, has been a party to the conflict, a catalyst and an accelerant. And part of the problem is that the American people are more enamored with the guy with all the medals, like David Petraeus, than they are with the expert in even the basement of Foggy Bottom or at the NGO or sitting in jail like Kathy or something because they're actually trying to do something. The American people are more enamored with that, sort of broad-shouldered, bemedaled general. And look where it's led us, right? 20 years and it ended here and it hasn't even ended. So that's my major problem with the media coverage is it's still militarized. It's rehashing the same sort of like debunked notions that more troops or just stay a little longer, light at the end of the tunnel, and it's still being accepted. And if the mainstream media chooses to post those people, to give them the slot on CNN, that's all the American people are going to hear in this rare moment where we're getting a lot of Afghan coverage. The problem is I'm glad they're covering Afghanistan, but the people they're having cover it are giving us all the wrong notions. And I think that's truly a tragedy.
And one of the people who could have given us crucially needed information is actually in jail right now. Daniel Hale has been sentenced to prison for being a whistleblower. And one of the things he wanted to make clear was that when he was working as an Air Force analyst, he was part of something called Operation Haymaker. And he clarified that U.S. government documents said that 90% of the time, the people that were the targeted victims in that operation turned out not to be combatants at all. Now, that's something people in the United States need to know, because then we can start to ask ourselves, well, why? Why would anybody feel such rage that they would organize a suicide bombing? Now, I have no idea who has organized the suicide bombing, but I do know that if you're a police person and a terrible crime happens, you're supposed to ask, okay, what was the motive? And we can't just write it off. As Danny has said, we can't just say, well, it's just, all Afghans are barbaric. There are reasons why people have grievances against the United States. This isn't to justify, but if we don't try to understand, we'll never be able to emerge into some kind of a peaceable way of living. And I don't think the military or the military contractors will help us understand. Not the people at Boeing or Raytheon or General Dynamics or Lockheed Martin. They understand that if they're going to keep selling weapons, they better have a war going on in this world. Maybe once upon a time people made weapons to fight wars, but now we make wars to sell weapons.
In fact, I'd just like to add just one quick thing to that. One of the things that's been sold to the American public, and Kathy, I'm so glad you brought up Daniel Hale, is that these weapons, the ordnance that I called in that Daniel Hale was, dealing with, we're told that they're precision and all of this. And of course, that is belied by the statistics, but a lot of people don't read the statistics. 2018 and 19, the U.S. and our allies were actually killing more civilians than the Taliban. That doesn't surprise me because this is how much human error plays in. One of my platoons called an airstrike, and a Marine Corps colonel flying an F-16 put longitude, latitude in instead of the military grid coordinate system and dropped a bomb on our base, killing a few Afghans and sending a blackout. I thought all of my friends were dead. That was just a thing that happened. It was just another day in Afghanistan. And that's not even the half of it, of course, the kill radius on these things. But the point is there's so much human error in this. The idea that these are precision weapons is sort of a farce. And of course, it feeds the resistance narrative, and it ends up empowering the Taliban into what they want to be, which is the Afghan nationalist resistance.
What do you have to say, Kathy, and then Danny, about the way the war is being framed as a question of human rights and women's rights?
Well, I think that after the Vietnam War, personally, I didn't know a soul who said, gee, let's see if we can't do that again. And so the military worked very, very hard in sync with think tanks and academics to kick the Vietnam syndrome. They wanted to make sure that in the future, no body bags would be seen. There would be embedded reporters who were embedded with the military. And then very importantly, they had to find a way to market the war as a humanitarian war. Now that, I know it should sound like a crazy oxymoron. How could you have a humanitarian war? But they had to say that this war would protect the women. It would protect the children. And then, it didn't, but there wasn't the kind of reporting or investigation dedicated to find out, well, what about the women? What about the children? And we should have been clued in through the Iraq War. I mean, in between the 1991 war and the 2003 war, hundreds of thousands of Iraqi children died tortuous deaths of starvation and gastrointestinal diseases, pneumonia, those conditions combined. How could they survive? They had only dirty water to have access to. We had knocked out every electrical facility all across Iraq. Caring about children, those little lives were snuffed out, and it was done shrouded in almost total secrecy. So then you get to Afghanistan, and the majority of the people in Afghanistan are women and children. But the idea that the United States troop deployments were protecting the women and the children, maybe just one statistic is helpful. At the height of the retrograde mission to take the troops out of Afghanistan, believe it or not, it was costing an average of $2 million per soldier for 1 year. At that same time, the amount that it would have cost to put iodized salt in the diet of a baby who would almost certainly have brain deficiency because of the severe hunger the child was experiencing, But, the UN knows how to do it. You get salt into the diet. It can offset the possibility of brain deficiency. And it would cost 5 cents per child per year. So can we imagine Lady Justice and the scales? Which one are you going to pick? But the choice is never made for the U.S. democracy. Democracy is based on education, but we're undereducated and misinformed.
I always felt that I was part of the problem. Like I said, I mean, we would shine up my mission, which was kind of the on the ground, like spear point military mission, right? We would shine it up with a human rights veneer, just a little gloss on there. And we would speak really intelligently about it. There was a PowerPoint slide I got to fill out every day saying all the wonderful things I did. And that was awkward because they were attacking my base every day. So, I mean, I could barely even get to the people, but we would pretend. And it was great. And everybody just rubbed each other's back and said that this is what we're doing. But even if you look back historically, it's clear that that's not why we went. Again, like I said, we backed some of the most reactionary elements of the Mujahideen who became warlords, some of whom coalesced into something similar to the Taliban or became, younger Taliban sort of fighters. Even down in Kandahar, I think the anecdotal can be instructive. The people we worked with, the power brokers in Kandahar who were, quote, on our side, which is complicated. It never was that linear. And I don't blame them for also working with the Taliban, whether it was the contractors or the sort of local tribal chiefs that we worked with. First of all, they were all talking to the Taliban, which I would have too, because we were leaving. I don't blame them for a second. Second of all, the way they treated their wives, the way they treated the young boys in their villages, there was often only like barely a little light between them and what the Taliban supposedly was. So many of the people that we were allied with were not living particularly different. I mean, they still cloistered their wives. They still, did. There was a pretty big bachi baz, which is like a child rape culture that was really big down in Kandahar. We were basically told not to do anything about that. That don't alienate the villagers. So clearly that wasn't about human rights. If we're not stopping child rape, like what are we doing? And we can't say that it's that, right? I mean, we could have that strategic argument, but clearly that wasn't the motivator. They were growing the same opium and poppy. The local police chief who went everywhere with my colonel. One time I was walking through a field and I said, we better report this poppy field. There's a lot of future heroin that's going to go to Paris and who knows where else, maybe back to my neighborhood. And then the elder next to me, he laughed. He said, you can't burn this field. This is Shafi Khan's field. Well, Shafi Khan was my colonel's number one guy. So in other words, the point is that this wasn't true everywhere. And obviously in some of the urban centers, there was certainly more progress and all that. But the idea that that's what motivated us, I find that to be really disingenuous, especially when it comes from the pro-war crowd. Especially when it comes to the people who were wrong about this from the start, who were wrong about Iraq, who were wrong about Libya, who were wrong about Syria, and they still get to weigh in and say, look, it was always about human rights. That was never true. That was never true down where we were fighting. And by the way, where I was in Kandahar, there were basically 3 areas that we were told were the key decisive areas if we're going to win this war during the surge. So I was there at the height of the troop counts. Helmand province and Kandahar province in the south, and then kind of the northeast, like Kunar and Nuristan. If we could beat the Taliban there, we could win. And the truth is, I got fought to a standstill. I didn't have any time for nation building. So when people say nation building didn't work in Kandahar where I was, or they say nation building didn't work across Afghanistan, I say, well, that's true. It did work one place, though, the suburbs of Northern Virginia outside D.C., where all the war industry executives work, because they all put additions on their McMansions. So nation building was hyper successful there, where wealth increased exponentially during the last 20 years. And that may sound snarky, but I think if we do not look at that, then we're not seeing the big picture about who profited and who didn't. My soldiers died for $30,000 to $40,000 a year. Afghans died for way less or nothing, and they weren't even asked. They weren't even asked whether they wanted to, whether we should be there. And I just think that we have to keep that in perspective. And I reject when the hawks tell me about human rights. I think we have to stop listening.
Quickly, just wanted to know, going back to the women's question. So it's clear, and like everyone watching this knows that wasn't the motive. Was there an improvement? And I'm not saying this to justify it. I mean, from what I understand, to the extent that there was any improvement for the lives of women and girls, which is hard to do when there's bombs going off, obviously. But to the extent that was in cities, and it was kind of a minority of the country that reaped any benefit of that. Can you guys comment on that?
Well, I think that would be true. I mean, the schooling in Afghanistan it needs a lot of improvement, but it's important for girls to go to school, and girls were studying hard and trying very, very, very hard to get beyond what would have been their experience in the village lives if they lived in the urban areas. And Danny is right. When you go out to the villages, many of the practices which are commonplace in terms of how women are treated and girls are treated were in practice well before the Taliban ever existed, and there wasn't a huge change in that regard. But it is true in the cities, girls were able to get the hang of going to school, and many of them studied very, very hard.
Mm.
And I mean, Kathy really knows this side more than me. You know, as a veteran, sometimes there's this credibility given to you, and that unless you were there and you fought and you carried a weapon, you don't really know. But the truth is, anyone who's been in a war knows that you see it like through a soda straw at 30,000 feet in many ways. So where I was, I didn't see any progress for women. In Kandahar City, there was probably some. In Kabul, there was a lot more. And that is like a real tragedy, because some of it is like a long-term, like 20-year false hope that the American military presence gave to some of the urban women. I take that seriously. I feel horrible about it. But the truth is, I think that we gave that very false hope because we never really had a military solution to the problem. And so while we might be able to cordon off individual enclaves where women could thrive, human rights could improve, well, the Soviets did the same thing.
A lot more.
Yeah, right. Because say what you will about communists, they tend to be pretty decent on feminism. I mean, relatively. And I'm not saying right, and a lot of things. I didn't like the Soviet invasion. I'm really just kind of anti-invasion. I feel pretty strong about that. But the truth is that it's remarkable how much similarity there was, because a lot of the same arguments were being made within the Soviet Union, in the Politburo, when they were debating in their small circles. There were people saying, well, what about our allies that we provided this space for and this education, and women were in the parliament and all that? You know, it's a very similar thing, but in the long term, there was never a military solution that could provide that for the whole country. So we gave a lot of false hope, and people are hurting.